Welcome back. I'm your host, Karina Gutierrez. Today, my guest Isabella Imani and I cover everything you need to know about narcissistic abuse. So if you're currently dating a narcissist, or maybe you have in the past, this episode is going to give you all the tools to understand how to identify the cyclical patterns of a narcissist, the psychological effects that these behaviors can have on your body, on your mind, and how to heal after this form of abuse. If you aren't familiar with Isabella Imani, she is an incredible trauma-informed coach for Fortune 500 CEOs. She is an author, she's a certified badass, and today you're actually going to be getting snippets of her book so you can get a taste of the magic. Let's get started. Isabella, what is narcissistic abuse?
Great question. When I'm coaching this, because this is a part of segments that I coach and I have a curriculum around it, I make a distinction between the difference between narcissistic abuse and domestic violence, right? And there are more similarities than there are differences. But I think that was a really important nuance for me to at least touch because narcissistic abuse is higher in severity. That's because with a narcissistic abuser, you are dealing with someone that actually has a genuine personality disorder, which means because of this personality disorder, they genuinely have a distorted view of reality. So the way that they treat people is they're less impacted by the way they treat people because of such a lack of empathy, which means a disconnection from self, which means a disconnect from others. So I think the biggest thing that I'd say is understanding the nuances that come with having that personality disorder and the severity of impact associated with it.
Yeah, it's funny. It made me feel compassion for them for the fact that they can't even have that level of empathy for themselves. So needless to say, they're not going to have it for someone else.
Yeah. And the thing about that too is, I mean, when I started doing a deep dive into this based off of my own, relationships with narcissists in the past, I realized my strength in terms of healing was actually learning to have compassion for them. And that's not to say, to not have boundaries, right? Compassion without boundaries can just lead to a lot of re-traumatization. But
Yeah.
I actually found healing from my narcissistic relationship because I was able to understand what was coming up for them with compassion. But that also allowed me to set the biggest boundaries the world has ever known because of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. How long into it did it take you to realize that he was a narcissist?
Oh boy, the narcissistic mask falls off pretty quick.
Hmm.
We were together for almost 2 years, and fun fact, we actually almost got married. I recognized pretty early on that he had a lot of just high conflict behaviors that I, made note of, but they were so minor. And, of course, when you're in the honeymoon phase, you can justify almost anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it felt like a behavior that, I'm like, this feels a little sticky. He doesn't entirely feel right. But it wasn't enough to be like, oh, this feels wrong, so I should leave. But going to your original question, it took me about 6 months to start to see the mask, or sorry, 6 weeks before I saw the mask fall off.
Wow.
Yeah. And my intuition was like red flags, high conflict partner. This is a lot. This is actually aggressive behavior. And we went through this whole, I mean, our relationship was verbatim textbook narcissistic abuse cycle. And knowing what I knew was helpful, speaking to the abuse and how painful and how difficult abusive relationships are hard to get out of. Intellectualizing my experience didn't take away from the emotional experience that I was having, which made that
Right.
exponentially harder to get out of. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah.
Can you actually highlight that cycle? I know you've told me before, I know it's in your book, but that cycle of narcissistic abuse.
Yeah. So I know one of the questions that we had talked about before we got on here was, understanding like how to identify when you're in a narcissistic relationship. So I want to touch on that as it relates to the narcissistic abuse cycle. So I think something that I'd love your listeners or just anyone to know based off of, my experiences is understanding that there are also just more than one type of narcissists,
Mm.
right? So there's the covert narcissist, which, in many ways ends up being the most impactful because it's the one less suspected, right? It's the person that seems like they're the do-gooder, right? Do good for all, and they do things from a place of altruism and spirituality and kindness, and those things are all beautiful, but it's all about intent, right? And is there like an exchange of energy where it's manipulative and I'm going to do this for you if I get X, Y, and Z in return? Is it
Mhm.
a way to maintain their platform and to be the center of attention and all the things? So understanding the different types of narcissists. So there's like covert narcissists, There's overt narcissists, there's somatic narcissists,
Mm.
and there's also cerebral narcissists. So understanding the different types will help you to identify someone who is pretty high on the narcissistic spectrum. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I didn't know about all of these types. What do
Yeah,
they
I didn't
mean?
either until I started to heal and did research into how did I get myself here and what
Right.
should I look out for next time, right?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Can you,
so that speaks to the first part. And then going back to your original question, which is what is the abuse cycle? Well, it first starts out with idolization and then love bombing, and then quickly leads into, devaluing and then triangulation, and then ultimately discard. And then there's like hoovering tactics. So that's the short summary of what the cycle looks like. But there's, of course, nuances to each of the stages.
Mhm.
And going back to what I said in my relationship, we went through the entire cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. I know
Yeah.
that people are now curious about what those stages mean.
Yeah. So, in short, idolization is a part of the honeymoon stage where, imagine meeting someone that just sweeps you off your feet. So, it's idolizing. I found the perfect person. This is my person. It's almost like too good to be true. But,
Mm.
of course, we all want to go into brand new love with nothing but hope and faith that this is going to work out. So, those are
Right.
normal things. There's nothing to be ashamed of in the idolization part. Then comes the love bombing, right? And this is where you can start to pick up on the nuances. It is
Mm.
almost like this over the top, grandiose gestures that are like covert forms of manipulation. It's the whole twin flame effect, like you are my person, I am yours, let's
Mm.
have babies tomorrow. It's the person that you meet within weeks and says, this is it, right?
Ah.
Together forever. Whereas true, authentic love takes time. You actually have to take the time to get to know someone, and it doesn't happen within months, right? I think research actually shows that it takes 4 to 6 months to really decide if this person is the person that you want to be with,
Mm.
right? So the first 6 months of relationship is absolutely crucial to picking up on these little things, because if you find yourself in a relationship with a narcissist, the easiest way to, avoid these types of relationships is to not get in them in the first place. And the
Mm.
way you avoid getting into them is by trusting your intuition and picking up on the red flags pretty early.
Yeah.
And then, so after that, so we went from idolization to love bombing, and then comes to the devaluing stage of
Mm.
the relationship. And that's where you start to see a lot more conflict happen. Who is this person in conflict? What are they like? And I tell my clients the difference between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship is the way that conflict is essentially managed, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And so during the devaluing stage, do they belittle you? Do they stop listening when you speak? Do they stop taking interest in you? Is it always one-sided? And that's a little bit more obvious. Now getting into the less obvious, which is why these guys are masters at, pretending to be like the ideal partner. It's
Mm.
all in the covert nuances. So even if they're not devaluing you, are they essentially valuing other people more than you in your relationship? So
Oh.
start to look for those things, because that's another form of manipulation and like their way of securing all of the attention, all of the what we call narcissistic supply, which is basically all of this like admiration from other sources. Right. Okay. So that's a part of the cycle. And I know I'm going through this pretty quickly. And then comes the triangulation. So once they start to devalue you, if you're in a relationship with this person, you're going to start to feel that tug away at your self-esteem. And that's
Mhm.
not going to feel particularly great. And that's when your wounds are going to start to surface, right? And we call that crazy making, right? When they do enough of these maladaptive things to make you start to believe that, oh boy, I'm crazy, right? Did I
Mm.
did I really see you prioritize that other person's need so overtly, like over mine, right? Did you really just say that thing? Did you really just put me down in front of that other person? So it
Mm.
starts to eat away at your self-esteem. Then comes, after they devalue you, the triangulation portion of the relationship. And this is, I mean, listen, they're all pretty painful. But I remember this being particularly painful in my relationship, where after he started to deteriorate at my self-esteem, basically, Isabella, you're crazy. None of that happened. Yeah, like maybe it did happen, but there were only a few photos, like wasn't that big of a
Mm.
deal. I'm sorry, get over it. Then with the triangulation, so imagine it's exactly what it sounds like, a triangle where it's a relationship with you, the narcissist, and then this third thing, usually another person, but it could also be like an exiting behavior towards work.
Mm.
But if they're triangulating you with another person, it's basically you, the narcissist, and the other person, where they actually start to give this third person more attention than you. It could be an old flame from the past or a new flame that they, met at work and they're best friends suddenly, right?
Mm.
So then comes the triangulation, and that's the narcissist's way of actually like bringing in more supply. And that's the start of the discard process. So, funny story, in my last relationship, he didn't know any of this, by the way, but the biggest reason I was able to leave that relationship was because I had such a close relationship with his mother, who was a saint. And she
Mm.
was the woman who behind the scenes gave me the courage to leave him.
Oh,
And she
wow.
taught me this phrase called monkey barring. I had no idea what it meant, because she had a very similar relationship with my former partner's father. And she goes, well, what does narcissist? And he was actually diagnosed with narcissistic personality
His
disorder.
dad.
His dad was. So it's hereditary. So it's the other part. But anyway,
Mm.
she goes, what does a narcissist do before they leave a relationship? They monkey bar. When monkeys are swinging through the jungle, they basically don't leave one vine before grabbing on to another.
Mm.
And so that's essentially what happens during the triangulation process, where they're looking for brand new supply, essentially
Oh.
to release or to replace you. So they're not going to leave you without having, another few things lined up. And
Mm.
that's a really unfortunate reality of what happened in my relationship, although I was the one who ultimately ended up leaving him
Mm.
before the fifth and final stage, which is the discard, right? Where a lot of narcissists, instead of dealing with a problem head on, they'll manipulate a situation to, essentially get rid of you or discard you. In the case of my relationship, because we've already been through the cycle at least a couple of times,
Mm.
he was such a high conflict partner that he would turn situations on to me. So if I saw him texting someone that, wasn't exactly healthy for our relationship,
Oh.
and I would, just ask about, what the relationship dynamic was, suddenly up in flames, our relationship would go. And it was, Isabella, you're crazy. I'm not doing anything. It's an ex, but we have
Mm.
boundaries. Why ask all these questions? Like, you don't trust me. And it was just immediate discard. So understanding the nuances there will help you. The cycle is also encompassing of just different understanding the different tactics of emotional abuse that these, I guess, predators, and that's, in my opinion, the best way to describe it, predators disguised as perfect partners. Understanding the different nuances of emotional abuse will also help you to either pull yourself out of these relationships if you find yourself in them currently,
Mm.
or to identify these patterns before you engage in them long term. That
Girl,
was
you
a
just
lot of information.
yeah, it was. And you blew my mind because I didn't know about the cycle, first of all. And it makes me think that it's probably really hard to leave it, especially after being idolized and
It's
being
so
love
hard.
bombed. Yeah, and thinking like, no, this
Yeah.
is my person. Do you think that people can get desensitized to love in the sense that, they're so used to this love bombing and this like being idolized and whatnot, that when someone comes along that's quote unquote healthy and maybe doesn't do that, they feel like it's like
Oh,
not even
yeah.
worth it / not enough. Is that a thing?
I think at 5,000% is a thing. I know that I even experienced that as I was healing, where I was so used to like the grandiose, like, I mean, listen, we knew each other and we hit it off right away, and we were spending so many days together, and we were going on like big grandiose trips almost immediately. And I
Mm.
was so used to that until I started to do the inner work. And I think I mentioned this earlier, where I call it kind of like a forest fire love, where
Mm.
it's like it's almost exactly like it is a forest fire, where you meet this person, it's hot and heavy pretty quick,
Oof.
you like have like this huge like passion, and then it ignites, right, and then it really just like implodes as quickly as it ignited. And that's the way
Oh,
I describe these types of
oh,
relationships. Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
So if someone is in a narcissistic relationship, is it doomed? Like, is it possible to have a healthy relationship with a narcissist?
I would consider it, and that's a great question, because that was a question that I even had to research. Can we make this happen? And one of
Wow.
the questions that I had to ask myself is, well, it's like, can you have a healthy relationship with someone who is consistently being unhealthy? And my answer to that was no, because I really had to look at, what was happening in our relationship. And as much, I mean, it was the most painful experience to leave a man that I was still madly in love with, and knowing all of the things, and even firsthand experiencing the psychological abuse,
Mm.
was enough data points. It was explicit data points, right, and repetitive. And I had to really sit down with that question, kind of framed differently than the question you asked, which is, can you have a healthy relationship with someone who is unhealthy?
Oof.
And that's something that your listeners will have to ask themselves when
Mm.
it comes down to it. But that was one of the reflection questions, because I do coach this. I then asked myself, which is, when is enough enough?
Mm.
Yeah.
That's tough to swallow, but also it makes me think of that very cliche saying, which is you can take the horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And knowing
Yeah.
you, I'm sure you brought him
Yeah.
to water numerous times, being the amazing coach you are. And it sounds like he wasn't willing to do the work.
The crazy part about that, and I actually really love that you said that, was it was a little deceptive, because on paper, it looked like we were doing the work. We had rituals. Our rituals were top-notch rituals where every morning we would do like sauna cold plunge. So we also had little affirmations that we'd do in the morning. We even did couples therapy once a week, sometimes twice a week if we really, really needed it. So much so that, on paper it was like, cool, like we were happy and healthy. But this goes to something that I speak to with all of my clients, and just a personal responsibility of myself and accountability of myself, which is taking in information is not the same as doing the work, right? You
Mm.
actually have to do something with the information that you're learning
Oof.
in couples therapy, in order to be healthy. So just because we were talking about our problems, we were doing a lot of, and this is actually a good nuance for your listeners to be mindful of too in their relationships. We were doing a lot of symptom
Oh,
management,
yeah.
but not root cause. And from a trauma informed perspective, we were working with a couples counselor who knew nothing about trauma informed anything. So it was really frustrating being in her presence, where I felt gaslit in session, even,
Ugh. Oh,
because
God.
it was so much focused on, okay, well, why are you texting these other women? Or it was the symptom of, okay, that you're texting these other women. So we'd conflict about that. But it's really the root cause of that is, why are you texting these other women?
Right. Right.
Right. And it gets a little circular. So pay attention to those nuances as well.
Yeah. Well, I can see how draining that must be, first of all.
Sure.
How does one find healing after that? Like after feeling like they were taking on a wild journey of ups and downs, how do you find healing after that?
My research was a lot of help. And I know not everyone's going to go and do their research, but it is something that I actually
Mm.
would advise people to at least know enough on to start to catch this as you begin to date. The biggest thing around these abusive relationship dynamics is they're not always physical. In fact, with these relationship dynamics, they're actually mostly psychological. So
Mm.
unless you're mindful of emotional abuse tactics, you are at a disadvantage. So
Ooh.
understanding that belittling is a form of emotional abuse is important. That there are things like narcissistic rage, narcissistic injury, there's, passive aggressiveness, there's pity play, there's reactive abuse, there's blame shifting, right? So understanding that will help you to heal. Understanding actually a lot about yourself, I
Mm.
think, is another way to help you to heal. I know for me, it's easy to point fingers at, who he was and additionally who he wasn't, right? But it does take 50-50. And this isn't a form of victim blaming, because I don't believe in blaming myself for my experience, but I do believe in personal accountability for my participation in my own experience, which meant I had to be really honest about getting to know who I was. And the things that I valued, which was, high empathy, forgiveness, all the things, I had to learn that, empathy without boundaries is really just another form of someone else being able to manipulate you.
Ooh.
So holding yourself accountable to doing your inner work. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. I know that sounds really, 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 really simple. There's nothing a narcissist hates more than
Hmm.
when you start to set boundaries. So being able to set boundaries and stay firm on those things and believing that you're worthy is certainly another great way to heal. And then the last thing I'll say about that too is finding safety in community. Oftentimes, when we find ourselves in abusive relationships, isolation is one of the key
Mm.
strategies a narcissist will use against their victims to pull them out of the safety of their social circles. I was a victim of this as well. We were traveling all over the world together
True.
nonstop. We were also going to a lot of events where it was mostly his friends, mostly his events. And so I was pulled away from the safety of my social circles, so much so that when the abuse got to where it was, and it was bad. It was very bad. I was so ashamed to tell the people that I'd already pushed away.
Oh.
So yeah. And because isolation is a form of, manipulation and abuse that they use as their strategy. Taking your power back by finding safety and not isolating anymore is another great way to heal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense why I mean, it makes complete sense why they would isolate you so that you
Yeah.
don't have anyone to count on. And oh my God, actually just had this epiphany. I wonder if isolating you then helps with the gaslighting because you're already questioning yourself. And then if you have no one to ask for external support,
Yeah,
you're just constantly
exactly.
questioning yourself in your brain.
Exactly. I
And
love that you said that because gaslighting is definitely one of the common forms of psychological abuse that a narcissist will use. And gaslighting is essentially when you make a person question their current reality. The hard part about that is that it just is extraordinarily invalidating. It makes you feel like what happened didn't actually happen. And you don't know, up from down or, who's safe and who's not safe and how much this person cares versus how much they don't care, and creating that push pull dynamic externally creates one internally. And when that starts to seep into your subconscious and you start doubting every part and piece of who you are and who other people are and who this person is in relationship to you, that makes it stickier to get out of for sure.
you basically start to not trust yourself in like at the most basic
Yeah,
level.
absolutely. I think one of the things that helped me to get out of my relationship is, well, several things, but certainly I then started reaching out to community, but I actually started to make a list. It was towards the last 2.5 months of our relationship when the abuse was so bad. It was absolutely at its peak. I was crying every single day, and it was no longer just like, belittling, here and there. It was every single day, several times a day, just aggressive name calling, yelling, picking fights out of thin air, all the things. So I started to make a list of everything he said. And I remember the day that I left him, I said, "Hey, you did X, Y, and Z things to me." And he goes, "No, I didn't."
Oof.
Blatantly to my face. "No, I didn't." And I go, he goes, "You have no proof." And I said, "I wrote everything down." And he goes, "That proves nothing. I never said any of those things." And even with the proof that I had, the real life documentation to support my beliefs, I still was like, "Oh, did I write those things down wrong?" Well, did any of this really happen? Because he just said no, but I remember it specifically, and I promised myself I'd write it down, and that was such a painful moment.
Yeah.
So certainly the safe communal support will help you to validate your experience. You have to be strong enough, and you have to be willing enough to accept it as well.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I hope what that anecdote does is helps people